If you just got a new inexpensive record player for the holidays, there's a very good chance it uses the same kind of turntable mechanism as what you see here. Maybe not with all this fancy pattern on the platter, but there's several different variations of these, including a deluxe model which comes with a fancy gold trim ring around the edge. This one cost me a whole $21 on Amazon, including shipping and tax. But aside from minor cosmetic differences, this is pretty much the standard for new, inexpensive record players sold today. You can see it's virtually all plastic construction, except for the aluminum tone arm. It has this instantly recognizable wedge-shaped ceramic phono cartridge with a dark orange colored stylus. You may have also seen and heard these inexpensive new turntables accused of destroying records.
Crosley turntables are very bad for this business. Kids are going to buy these cruddy turntables. They'll play Dark Side of the Moon 5 times, and then the grooves will all be chewed up, and they'll say, this is a stupid hobby. Why did I get into this?
But if that was the case, then all of your parents' records would have been ruined too, because on the left here is a turntable mechanism that came out of a 1988 Magnavox stereo system, and you may see a striking resemblance between these two. Including the same type of ceramic phono cartridge, the Chuo Denshi CZ800. So you may think 1988 is as far back as these cheap plastic turntable mechanisms go, but you'd be wrong, because here is a cheap plastic turntable mechanism from 1984. And this time the cosmetic differences are a little bit more pronounced, but it's mostly just decoration, trying to make this thing look fancier than it actually is. Aside from that, you can see the direct lineage between these two, and you can also see a lot of cost reduction that took place between this 1984 design and this 1988 design. So a lot of people think of these cheap black plastic turntables as something that brands like Crosley and Victrola came up with within the past decade due to the resurgence of vinyl records. But in fact, they've been around for a lot longer than most people think. You can see I've been able to trace the design all the way back to 1984. And you may be wondering, who's to blame for this? Who came up with these cheap plastic turntables? Well, I can not only give you the name of the company who first invented these turntables, I can even give you the name of the person who invented these turntables. So let's take a closer look at this 1984 mechanism. It has an all-plastic platter with a built-in 45 RPM center hole adapter. This is a real strobe mark around the edge, although it discovered it's only for 45 RPM. So when I'm playing at 45 RPM, the strobe dots appear to be stationary. This has a mechanical speed selector switch on the side here, which we'll take a closer look at in a minute. One nice touch is that the tone armrest has a built-in holder, so when you want to clamp it in place, you just push it down a little harder and it locks into place. It has a tetrad ceramic cartridge with fake screws holding it in place. And likewise, what is designed to look like an adjustable counterweight is also fake. It's just a plastic molding and there's nothing in it, nor is there a counterbalance spring. So as you might expect, the tracking force is rather heavy. A bit over 6.5 grams. The stylus is a T50 HD and you can still buy replacements for it today, and it does appear to have a diamond tip on it. And this recess in the middle of the platter actually has a functional purpose. It's for when you're playing 7-inch records. Makes it easier to place them on the platter and also lift them back up again. And if you're wondering who manufactured this fine machine, it says right there on the bezel, BSR Belt Drive. Here's the underside of the mechanism. We'll take a look at the motor. It's made by Sankyo, made in Taiwan, but it's a single speed motor. You can see it only has one adjustment trimmer. Runs on 12 volts DC. There's the information plate for the turntable, made in Taiwan by BSR. It's model P284. These BSR stickers always say, always quote above reference. There's the connector for the power and audio output. Has 5 pins, and the pin out from top to bottom when viewed at this angle is positive 12 volts DC, ground for the power, ground for the audio, left channel output, and right channel output. There's the sticker of who made the bass. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name. And unfortunately it's missing the year on the date stamp, but on the underside of the platter there we can see a 1984 date code. And here's the function of that mechanical speed selector switch that I mentioned. Right now the turntable is running at 33 1/3 RPM, and I'll switch it to 45 and you'll see what happens. See, the belt actually moves. There's a little plastic lever which pushes the belt as you move the speed selector switch to move it to one of two positions on the motor spindle. So if I switch it back to 33 1/3, you can see it pushes the belt back up to what is the upper half of the spindle when viewed from this angle. It was only with the introduction of cassette decks of high-speed dubbing in the mid-1980s that dual-speed DC motors started becoming readily and inexpensively available. So prior to then they would use a single-speed DC motor and this kind of belt jump system to change the speeds using a mechanical lever to push the belt to one of two positions on the motor spindle. For a sample of how this 1984 BSR mechanism sounds, I have it connected to this 12-volt gel cell DC battery, and I have it wired to an audio output here, which I will connect to this Realistic SA155 amplifier, whose phono input is switchable between a magnetic and a ceramic cartridge. So because this turntable has a ceramic cartridge, I'll set it to that position.
Stung my eye and rolled down my cheek when I heard you were moving away. Are you moving away? Yeah, it's time to go to reverse from the track onto the long wide road. Right down the drive through dust and rain and snow. Eyes on the map.
And here is the 1988 mechanism. By 1988, both cassettes and CDs had overtaken vinyl records in sales. So, in most inexpensive stereo systems, a turntable was considered more of an afterthought. So as a result, the design got drastically simplified, including now using an electronically speed switchable motor. So what was previously the mechanical speed selector switch is now just a mounting point for the turntable. And whereas this one has a built-in pop-up adapter for playing 45s with the large center hole, on this one it got eliminated, requiring you to use a separate adapter. There is still a recess in the middle of the platter to help you place and remove 7-inch records, although it's not nearly as deep or wide as on the 1984 platter. The turntable platter still has strobe marks on the edge, but they're not painted silver, so they're much less visible, and they're only for 50 Hz AC power, so under my 60 Hz North American lighting it looks like it's running at the wrong speed unless I slow it down. Then you can see the strobe effect at 33 1/3 RPM. And at 45 RPM the same thing. If I slow it down, then you can see the strobe effect. So it still has a strobe, but it's not as visible, and it's only for 50 Hz AC power. So overall it's very similar to the turntable mechanisms they're still making today. In fact, the fancy gold trim ring that my brand new mechanism came with fits perfectly on this one. The tone arm uses the now commonplace Chuo Denshi CZ800 ceramic cartridge. It is a genuine Japanese-made Chuo Denshi cartridge, and this must be the original stylus it came with when it was new in 1988, because you can see it's a lighter orange color, and I think by the early 90s they switched to the darker reddish orange color that is common today. It's a sapphire tip stylus on a plastic cantilever, and there you can see the Chuo Denshi logo on it. So I'm almost 100% certain this is the original stylus this turntable came with. It was never replaced. And just as before, what may look like a counterweight is just an empty plastic housing. There is no weight or counterbalance spring in this, and the tracking force is definitely on the heavy side at 6.8 grams, But that was actually considered acceptable because the Panasonic stereo system that my parents had when I was a kid in the 1980s also had a rated tracking force of 5 to 7 grams. And although I'm sure it wasn't the kindest to the records we played on it, it did not ruin any of them. One thing worthy of note is that while all three of these mechanisms have an auto-return tone arm, this 1988 one has by far the quickest. Underneath of this mechanism is where I really struck gold in terms of discovering the history and origin of the cheap record players made today. First, you can see the sticker of who made the bass. It's the same company who made the one for the 1984 mechanism, but notice the date on here, 77. This is definitely not from 1977. Well, it turns out this is year 77 in the traditional Republic of China calendar, which is used in Taiwan. And if you look that up, that equals 1988 in the Western calendar. And here's another familiar sight, if you remember the 1984 BSR mechanism. It's the same kind of red model number sticker, except now, instead of BSR, it says Capetronic. And the model number is Q622. And it likewise says always quote above reference. In what little information I can find about the history of BSR, it says they stopped manufacturing record players in 1985, and my guess is they handed over their designs and production facilities to Capetronic in Taiwan, who continued manufacturing these cheap record players, and they incremented the model number series from P to Q. So if you trace back the history of these things, it was actually BSR who first made them, and then in 1985 they handed it over to Capetronic in Taiwan. And then sometime later, they got handed over again to various Chinese manufacturers, which we'll look at later in the new mechanism. There's the dual-speed motor. Doesn't have any brand name on it. And it has the same 5-pin connector and pinout as the 1984 mechanism. And here's where it gets really interesting. On the bottom of this 1988 mechanism, it lists patent numbers, so we can look these up. And here it is, United States patent number 4734902, filed on May 8th, 1985, and approved on March 29th, 1988. The inventor was James T. Dennis of Oklahoma City, and the illustration looks very similar, although not exactly identical to what we just saw. The detail of these illustrations is amazing. It was clearly hand-drawn. And the write-up is very detailed, but it's basically all about cost reduction. It talks about how the existing record changers that were popular in the 1970s and early 1980s were quite complicated and expensive to manufacture on a mass production basis. So one of the objectives of this invention was to provide a new and improved single record player of the auto return type, which is extremely simple and inexpensive to manufacture, assemble, and test on a mass production basis. And if we look up its inventor, James Dennis of Oklahoma City, he passed away in 2018 at the age of 88. The obituary talks about how his parents bought a record player which fascinated him. He decided that he could design a better one, and he did. He designed one, made a homemade sample, put it in a suitcase, and showed it to all the major manufacturers on the East Coast. He licensed the design to Glazier Steers Company, which sold the record changers for several years. One of his later designs was the first automatic changer that could play intermix records of different sizes and speeds. And he later designed a compact disc player which could be loaded and reloaded while playing another CD. Both of these became industry standards, selling worldwide in the millions by General Electric, Magnavox, Pioneer, Philips, RCA, Sony, Sansui, and others. His continuing innovations earned 38 U.S. patents, as well as registrations in many other countries. So there's the man who invented the cheap record players that millions of people are using today, James Dennis of Oklahoma City. So let's give a listen to this 1988 mechanism and see if all of Mr. Dennis's patented cost reduction affected its sound quality in any way.
Launch when ready.
I never thought that I would be
Here's where you could possibly blame Crosley. In their company history on their website, they mentioned that they introduced their first turntable in 1992, and I was able to find an article mentioning that in the early 1990s, Crosley was using a US supplier for their electronics, but that supplier went out of business in 1992, so Crosley's CEO Bo Lamastas flew to southern China to negotiate a deal directly with the manufacturer in China. So definitely by 1992, these turntable mechanisms were being manufactured in China. Here's another one of these mechanisms which I did not show previously because it's part of a huge TX stereo system from 2002 which wouldn't fit on my table with all the others. But you can see the platter is almost identical to the one on the 1988 version, including the strobe marks on the edge which only work at 50 Hz. This one I actually modified to upgrade the cartridge. I did a video about that back in 2018, which I'll include a link to right now. So this currently has an upgraded Bampa BP2 ATC cartridge, but it originally came with one of these Chinese clones of the Chuo Denchi CZ800, the same kind you see today, with the red stylus. I've modified this tone arm to add a makeshift counterweight because the upgraded cartridge requires a lighter tracking force, but it did originally have a counterbalance spring in this, and with the original cartridge it tracked at right around 5 grams, which is lighter than the two previous ones we looked at. It also has 78 RPM speed, which is now commonplace on these inexpensive record players. Because of that electronically speed switchable motor, it only requires a very minimal amount of extra circuitry to add the third speed to it. So even though most people aren't playing 78 RPM records anymore, it really doesn't cost them anything extra to include it. The motor has an almost identical model number sticker as what we saw on the 1988 version, although this time it claims to have been made by Sankyo, although I don't know if that's genuine or a clone. And here again is that same 5-pin connector with the same pinout, and this one from 2002, the manufacturer was Huki. It's a model HT1000 record player. I tried looking that up, I got absolutely no results. So it's probably some OEM in China which is no longer in business or is using a different name these days. And to show you just how compatible these mechanisms have become since they moved the production to China in the 1990s, I'm going to remove this original 2002 mechanism from this stereo system, and I'm going to install this brand new 2020 mechanism, and it fits perfectly. So here we finally have reached the latest state of the art of these Chinese record player mechanisms. And like I said at the beginning, there's several different variations of these with slight cosmetic differences, such as with or without this fancy trim ring. And this one must have been designed for the people who complained that the strobe marks on this type of platter were not visible enough. So they made the whole damn platter the strobe marks. There's now a total of 6 sets of strobe marks for the 3 different speeds at 50 and 60 Hertz line frequencies. And they made this recess in the middle of the platter to help you place and remove 7-inch records deeper and wider than before, so that's another improvement. And of all the mechanisms I've shown, this new 2020 version is the only one with a damped lowering action on the cueing lever to gently lower the stylus onto the record. But as for how gentle it would be to your records once it's actually playing them, this tone arm does not have a counterbalance spring, even though it was designed to include one, so it tracks at right around 7 grams, which is the heaviest of all of these. But again, that kind of tracking force was considered acceptable. Here's a list of Stanton professional phono cartridges from 1992, and in their calibration standard series, their 890AL cartridge had a rated tracking force of anywhere from 2 to 7 grams. Underneath, the motor is made by Hi-Jet, never heard of that brand before. And the connector now has 6 pins instead of 5. They added what they call a control pin between the 12-volt DC power supply pin and the power ground pin. However, I discovered that the control pin is the same thing as the 12-volt DC power input. If I check it with my multimeter, it measures continuity. So what you can do is just ignore this last pin and use those 5 pins just as you used before. So I was actually able to take this 5-pin connector from this 2002 TX stereo system, plug it into this connector using those 5 pins, and it works perfectly. I just had to trim off this tab here to get it to fit. And to give you a sample of how this new 2020 mechanism sounds and how it compares to the others, I'm actually going to play the same song on all of these mechanisms. It's Sugar Blues by John LaDuca, Mr. Fantastic, in the Wonderful World of Wurlitzer. So here's the complete evolution of cheap black plastic record player mechanisms from 1984 to 1988 to 2002 and finally to 2020. I wonder if Marty McFly could have predicted that record players would have stayed so consistently mediocre well into what he thought of as the future.